Hi, my name is Josh Arthur. I'm a general pediatrician at St. Louis University, and I want to talk with you today about how to do a social history with an adolescent. In our clinic at Donny Pediatrics, typically for a child between the ages of 12 and 18, they're considered an adolescent. All of those children will get a private interview. All of those children will have a depression and substance abuse screening form completed prior to their visit, confidentially and by themselves. So, in pediatrics, one sort of common way of taking a social history from an adolescent is by doing something called a HEADSS exam. So HEADSS, H-E-A-D-S-S, sometimes there's a third S, stands for home environment, education, activities, drugs and other substances, sexuality, suicidality, or mental health. Then the last S that some people will use stands for safety. And I'll talk a little bit about each one of these. When I'm doing social history on a child, with a child, typically I do that history towards the end of the visit. They are typically accompanied by a parent, and for most of the history I perform the evaluation with the parent in the room, often because the parent may have different concerns than the child, the parent may know different pieces of information than the child, and having both of them in the room allows me to get as much information as possible. Certainly there are exceptions when children come by themselves, or there is something that is sensitive that I don't want the parent in the room for, or the child in the room for that matter, but I'm going to talk to you today just about sort of what the default would be. So, typically I've spent 10, 15, 20 minutes talking with the parent or parents and the child, and during that time I've learned of any medical concerns, I've learned about any academic concerns. At the end of that time I will do a physical exam with the parent in the room. There are times when I think the social history that I'm going to get privately may change the type of physical exam I do, in which case I may do the exam after the HEADSS exam. Either way, it typically goes history for a while with the family, then the social history with the child by themselves, and then the physical exam. Sometimes the physical exam and the HEADSS exam or the social history will get flip-flopped depending on the scenario. So how do I get a parent out of the room? So typically, by the time I've talked to them for 10 or 15 minutes, I've built rapport, I've let the parent and the child know that I care about them, that I'm trustworthy, we have a therapeutic alliance. Often I've already done a physical exam, and then I say something like, you know, this child, I would use their name, is growing up. It's amazing how fast things go, isn't it? And so for every child of 12 or 13 or 14 years of age, I like to talk with them a little bit by themselves to give them some practice in speaking for themselves about their health and asking their own health questions. And so for this part of the exam, I like to ask parents to step out to the waiting room, and then I'll talk to your child a little bit by themselves, and then I'll come grab you in a few minutes. I would say I can't think of any time over the past 5 years that a parent has refused to leave the room. When I sort of framed the issue as an opportunity for their child to learn and grow, and I said it sort of frankly and explicitly towards the end of the visit. Another thing I typically do is at the 10 and 11-year-old visit, I actually prepare the family. I say, you're getting so old. You know, next time when I come and see you, I'm going to give you an opportunity to talk to me by yourself. That's part of growing old, and that prepares both the parent and the child for me asking to talk to the child by themselves. So once I have the child by themselves, the next step for me is to clarify confidentiality. And for the sake of this conversation, I will use the name Josh for this child. I'll say, Josh, thanks for talking with me for a moment. I just want to let you know that we'll be having this conversation every time you come in for a checkup. When we have a conversation, what you share with me is confidential. That means that if you were to tell me that your mom is crazy or your dad is crazy, I can't go out there and say, do you know what Josh said? You guys are crazy. That's confidential. However, if I thought that you or somebody else was in danger, I would have to share with somebody. And so that's all I say. And then I just launch into the HEADSS exam. Now, many times I've already gone through H, E, and A, the home environment, education, and activities while the parent was in the room. So I often go through this pretty quickly. But sometimes there's more to say. So for H, I'll say something like, so remind me who lives with you? They'll say, oh, my parents, or my parents, my siblings. And I'll say, how do you get along with everybody? And they'll share whatever their concerns are, and any positive screening. So they say, I don't get along with my brother or my parent. I go into that more deeply. Some sort of parental discord that I detect, I go into that more deeply. And then I may end up with something like, that sounds great. Has there ever been a time that you didn't feel safe in your home or didn't feel safe with your family? And if everything seems clear, I move on to activity or to education. With education, often I'll already know something about their school performance. I'll say, so how are things going in school? What are your favorite things that you do? What are things that are particularly hard for you in school? And tell me about your long-term plans. And for a 12-year-old, they may not know long-term plans, but I at least get them to sort of imagine some sort of aspirations. And then I write that down so that I can ask them about those aspirations going into the future. And as an aside, when people don't have aspirations, I try and convince them all to do pediatrics. But certainly acknowledging that there are many other valid and wonderful jobs out there. Then I move on to activities. So I ask them, well, so after the school day's over, what do you do? Do you hang out with friends? Do you do things at your school? Do you do things in your community, with a religious group? Tell me what you enjoy doing. And typically that might allow me to talk more about sports, or might help me talk to them a little more about screen time, or encouraging them to do productive activities at school or at home. And then I get to the harder parts of the evaluation. So then getting to drugs. So typically what I'll say in almost every age group, although I often go a little bit more slowly with younger kids because I think I need to define my terms a little more. The way I'll typically have this conversation is I may say something like, remind me who you hang out with most of the time when you're just on your own. People from school, people from your neighborhood, and they'll tell me something, and then I'll say, so those friends, do you know if any of them have ever done things like smoking tobacco or marijuana, using electronic cigarettes, people call that like vaping or Juuls, used alcohol, any other drugs or prescription drugs or things like that? And they may say yes or no. Regardless of what they say, I'll say, well, has anyone ever tried to get you to use one of those things? They'll say yes or no. And then I'll say, have you ever tried or used any of those things? And then they'll say yes or no. And then wherever they lead me, I'll follow down that path and do some anticipatory guidance as much as I can. After asking about drugs, then I go straight to sexuality. That's the first S I do. And so I say, well, any those friends you told me about, any ones that you have a romantic relationship with? And then they'll say something, and I'll say, sometimes they don't know what I mean by romantic, and I'll say, like a boyfriend or girlfriend, and I say that for both, whether I'm speaking with a boy or with a girl, and they'll tell me some relationship they've had, or some relationship, or that they haven't, and again, I'll follow that wherever it goes. If they don't have a romantic relationship, I'll say, have you ever had one in the past? Are you interested in a romantic relationship with boys or with girls? And typically, they'll tell me what their interests are. They'll tell me whether they've had a relationship or not. And then, regardless of what they tell me, I say, have you ever been in a physical romantic relationship with somebody? Things like holding hands, kissing, having sexual intercourse, or oral sex. Again, sometimes I have to change how I have this conversation with a 12-year-old versus an 18-year-old, but I try and be a little bit specific about what I'm asking. And then they'll say yes or no, and then I'll ask for more specifics. I may say, well, when did this happen? And here I'm stratifying risk I say, when that happened, did you use a condom or did you use any birth control? So I'm figuring out when things happened, how frequently they happened, and there's lots of ways, of course, you could take that sort of a sexual history. And then I also ask about coercion. So no matter whether they say yes or no to having had sexual contact, I say, has anyone ever forced you to do any of those types of things? Or if you ever felt uncomfortable with somebody trying to do, asking you to do those types of things? Again, if all that's negative, I move on to the next S, which is suicidality. The way I ask that question is I say, so do you consider yourself a happy person, a sad person, sort of an in-the-middle person most of the time? Most people say either happy or in the middle. Regardless of what they say, I say, well, so what do you do when you are feeling down, when you're feeling sad? Maybe I sometimes prompt them by saying, do you listen to music, watch a movie, talk to a friend? And they'll say, oh, I should go to my room and listen to some music. I say, have you ever, again, for everybody, no matter what they answer the question with, I say, have you ever felt so down that you ever thought of hurting yourself? If they say yes, I go into that further. If they say, and asking about a plan or attempts and things like that. If they say no, then I move on. Again, I should have in my hand, at least at our clinic, both a craft survey, which screens for substance abuse, and a PHQ-9, which screens for depression in adolescents. And so I will often use both of those to prompt the way I ask questions. Hey, you mentioned that sometimes you feel guilty or sad or depressed. Tell me more about that. So for the D and the S part of this, I will use those to help prompt me. But even if those are negative, I will still ask at least the introductory questions to those sections. And then the last S is going to be safety. Typically, I will say something like, you're doing really great, you're really healthy, and the good news is kids your age tend to stay pretty healthy. The way that people mostly get hurt is through accidents. Things like accidents with firearms, accidents with cars, or accidents with bikes. And so one of the most important things for you to do before I see you next year is make sure the things that you're doing are careful. That you're careful with when you drive in a car and wear a seatbelt, that you're careful on a bike, you wear a helmet, you're careful in your relationships as far as, and then sort of I'll counsel them however I did on the sexuality, practicing. Basically, I always try and move people incrementally one step healthier than they were. If they have lots of sexual partners, have less sexual partners. If they're having unprotected sex, have protected sex. If you're having protected sex, have abstinence. So everything, I always think it would be great to take people from unhealthy all the way to 100% healthy. And if I can do that, I'm certainly going to recommend it, but often I try and find an achievable goal. And so I'll sort of fit those achievable goals for safety into this sort of last bit of my HEADSS talk, because after that, I'm having the parent come back in the room. So I've talked about safety, and then I just open the floor to the child. I say, hey, so thanks for answering all my questions. I know that they were nosy, and I'm going to ask you those questions every year. And it may be that the answer to those questions are no this year, and it may be yes next year. Just so you know, you can always be free to give me a call, to talk to me during visits, between visits if you have questions, or if these answers change, or if you need my help, and those things will be confidential. So I say that, then I open the floor and say, hey, so do you have any other questions that you would want to ask me about your health or your body? And then people ask me the strangest questions sometimes. Sometimes they want to be taller. Sometimes that people will ask me questions about their sexuality, or share things about their sexuality. All of these are things that are fair game and an opportunity to provide counseling. The one other really important thing I do is that when I get to this last section, often kids have disclosed something like mental illness, anxiety, depression, something that I really think that they need help with, but it's going to be hard for them to get counseling if their parents don't know about it, or take medicines that I might prescribe them for depression or anxiety or something else if their parents don't know about it. But remember, I have told them that our visit is confidential, and it is. And so typically at the end, almost all the time, I say, so you shared with me some really important things, and I think we can make a big difference and make you feel better. But I think we're going to need your parents' help. And like I told you, that everything is confidential. But would you mind if I share this a little bit with your parents? Because I think it's going to be really hard for me to help you without them knowing. So I really try and convince the child to let me tell their parents. And if they say no, I won't. And I might even try and make some interventions, but it's going to be a lot harder without their parents' input. The other thing I do is, one part of the adolescent evaluation is that if a child is sexually active, every year when I see them, I do at least a gonorrhea and chlamydia urine test, and again, depending on the history, I may be also doing an HIV, syphilis, maybe trichomonas, some other testing, and I will do those tests during the visit, and I won't have those results at the end of the visit. So the other thing I ask the child while the parent is out of the room is, so we're going to do some lab tests today. When those results come back, do you have your own phone number that I can contact? Would you prefer that I email you? Would you prefer that I talk to your parent? So I need to figure out a way to contact that child confidentially, or have them waive their confidentiality when those lab results come back. I just say this because it's really complicated later. If we haven't had that conversation, chlamydia comes back positive, and I only have the parent's phone number, then I'm having these awkward conversations with parents, and I haven't actually figured out the best way to do it with the child. So once that's all done, typically it's been 10 or 15 minutes, and then the HEADSS exam is done. I will say, I think just in closing, that this seems like an awkward conversation, but what I've learned is that kids are actually pretty honest. Kids actually are willing to have a conversation with their doctor if you do one of two things. One, it's great if you know the patient well, if you've seen them year after year. And two, even if you don't know them year after year, if they trust you. And so the way that you start your appointment, the way you start your conversation with the teenager by themselves, your comfort level, your confidence, you smiling and caring about them, all of those are things that will make this an encounter that's comfortable for you and for the teenager, and also give you an ability to do something to help. So thanks.